Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you to Ollie and the entire Carbon Unbound team for putting together this excellent event. Very excited for the Direct Air Capture panel. My name is Jason Hockman. I am the co-founder and executive director of the Direct Air Capture Coalition, which is a global nonprofit multi-stakeholder coalition of nearly 120 different companies, nonprofit organizations, civil society groups, and research and academic institutions located around the world, working together to help advance and accelerate the development and deployment of direct air capture technology. I'm privileged to be moderating this panel with panelists Nicholas Eisenberger, Gianna Amador, Josh Santos, and Rob Van Straten, and I will let them all introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they do in the space. Nick?
Thank you, Jason. Hi, I'm Nicholas Eisenberger. I guess I have both the luck and the glutton for punishment of having been in the carbon space for over 17 years now. I led the financing for the Carbon X Prize along with my colleague Nikki Baxter, who's here, you saw on the panel earlier. And then we started something called the Circular Carbon Network. Anjali Underwood is here representing, and Annie as well from the Carbon Unbound team. And then started something called the CREO Syndicate, which is a family office network that is focused on climate tech solutions, and I chair the carbon removal committee there. And then Jason and I started the Direct Air Capture Coalition together, and I chair that. And then I'm the former president of Global Thermostat, which is a direct air capture company that my father actually co-founded over 17 years ago, so I was an early investor, and then went in-house a couple years ago to help grow that. So very excited to see the growth of this. I heard there was over 50% more people here this year than last year, which is amazing. And it's just wonderful to be up with these folks talking about direct air capture at this point in the evolution of this important industry.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gianna Amador. I'm the executive director at the Carbon Removal Alliance. We are a new organization working to narrow the gap between carbon removal innovators who are developing technologies themselves and U.S. federal policymakers. So we work with some of the industry's leading companies, translating the challenges they're facing as they're trying to commercialize a whole portfolio of carbon removal technologies and feed that into U.S. federal policy to try to help kickstart and scale some of these really important solutions.
Good morning, Carbon Unbounders. My name is Josh Santos, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Noya. At Noya, we're developing technology to deliver grid services and clean water alongside high-quality carbon removal credits. We've been building since 2020, and it's an absolute joy to see all of you all, a bunch of old faces, some new faces, and a 50% year-over-year growth is not too bad for a carbon removal summit. So good to see you all and excited to be here today.
So good morning, everybody. My name is Rob van Straten. I'm CEO of Skytree. We're a developer and manufacturer of direct air capture technology for both utilization as well as removal use cases. And it's funny, I just saw on the display here, Dutch colony of New Amsterdam established on Manhattan Island, 1624. So that's 400 years ago, and now we are here to establish Skytree North America. It's another memorable moment from the Netherlands.
So the first question I want to ask, I think, builds on one of the earlier panels, and it's about how policy, what role policy can play in driving demand for direct air capture and driving down costs, both in the United States and internationally. And I'd like to start with Gianna. You can discuss the work you're doing in driving policy and what you see. And I'd like to then send it over to Rob to talk about the European environment.
Jason and Gianna, can I make one quick suggestion? Very pesky. Can we move your seat up by a quarter meter and yours up by a quarter meter? Because it's really hard to see you guys. All right, now we can have a conversation.
We got to look each other deep in the eyes
we do,
while we're talking.
We do.
All right, great. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about the role for policy. I'm sure it's not a surprise for anyone here, but I think policy, and from my seat, focusing on U.S. federal policy, has kickstarted a number of technologies, climate solutions. I think in particular, we have a really strong playbook looking at renewable energy technologies like solar and wind. using a number of tools in the toolkit, like research and development and demonstration funding, tax credits, compliance markets, regulations, all of these things that can help support the deployment and innovation of technologies and bring them to scale. So really, in my mind, we need to take that playbook that we've seen work for other technologies and adapt it to the carbon removal space. I think one thing that's unique or a little bit different from renewable energy technologies is that carbon removal doesn't have a robust market in which these companies can sell into. Many of these companies are just essentially generating a public good, which means I think there's even a greater role for the government to play in creating markets and to drive customers to these carbon removal solutions. And that, to me, feels like the biggest gap that we have today. I think, again, from the US perspective, there's a number of sort of demand policies that the US federal government can take. I think the Department of Energy's CDR purchasing prize is a really great landmark policy that really puts the government as the first customer for some of these solutions like direct air capture. So it'll be critical to scale that program, but to also think about other demand levers like tax credits, across other solutions, things like conservation programs that can really help drive customers and revenue for these solutions.
Yeah, so a European perspective on this is that I think policymakers in the EU are underway to merge voluntary carbon markets and compliance, such as ETS, which is sort of a well-working system of carrot and stick. Removal projects often take years to develop, right? The permitting, the land, offtake agreements, and all of that. Well, there's a lot of opportunity in utilization. And utilization markets can be fulfilled short-term and can, pump up volume of systems to be deployed by DEC companies. So, there are multiple ways that governments can stimulate DEC to be used for utilization. A great example is Shell, for instance, in the Netherlands. So they capture around 300,000 tons of fossil fuel CO2, and they announced to redirect that to storage under the North Sea with the Portus project. That means that there's an opportunity for 300,000 tons of CO2 to be installed at greenhouses. So that's one of our key markets where we focus on. And that, provides volume because we just can install units. We can, get volume in our supply chain, and that will help to cost down while we are developing larger scale removal sites with our technology.
Josh or Nick, if you'd like to chime in.
I always like to think about these things as what are we ultimately trying to solve for? And we're trying to solve for sustainable demand, which is, I define as companies wanting to line up to buy a thing. Right? We have sustainable demand for Airbnbs. We need to build that for carbon removal. And I think it's more interesting to look at the reasons that people are not quite doing that yet to understand what policy can do to enable that to happen. And from a lot of the conversations we've had, folks are saying things like cost, supply, availability, trustworthiness, these sorts of things. We've seen policy step in to help solve a lot of that. Gianna talked about the carbon removal procurement prize, which is a massive unlock for providing revenue into this market. We've seen DAC Hub funding and other grants helping to solve the capital cost issues. But I think by looking at things like how can we provide cheaper sources of energy, which is something that all direct air capture companies could really use in droves, or looking at how we can ensure that we're providing a transparent view into what supply means and how we should think about good supply, are a few areas that policy has a real opportunity to help step in and accelerate this market.
Yeah, I agree with that. In theory, I think there's sort of 5 or 6 main categories for policy to play here. One is pricing, which, a price on carbon would really accelerate things, but that's only happening in bits and pieces around the world. But the more, ultimately, I think it's going to be necessary here. I think a lot of people think that. Then you have capital. which the DOE here in the United States and other places is starting to play. I'm going to come back to that because I think that's, in the near term, the most important. Purchasing, like offtakes, which is, again, the government and all other corporates have started to step up there, and that's very important. And the purchasing power of the United States government and other governments around the world is incredibly powerful and needs to be deployed even more than it is. You have rules of the road, so things like MRV and other standards. You have infrastructure, so things like, you know, where does the energy come from, how does it get piped, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have regulatory sticks in terms of, you know, making it difficult, which the pricing can also achieve for, you know, ongoing pollution of the atmosphere. Just coming back very quickly, this is a theme that at least I will talk about, and I have heard come up already this morning, and I'm sure we'll get into more broadly here, is this capital piece, as great as it is, and as much money as the DOE is deploying. And you know, if you asked me 5 years ago, would the United States be the leader in this space, I would have said no, but is in terms of providing grant capital for deployment of DAC hubs and related infrastructure. But we need more. Like, we need to get more turns on this technology for all the different DAC solutions out there as soon as possible, in order to be able to bring down the unit cost, get down the cost curve, and develop the supply chains, develop the project financing, develop the project development pieces that need to be in place for scaling. So capital, 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 in my view, is the need in the short term.
So that is a perfect segue to my next question, the next thing I want to talk about. We are located here in downtown Manhattan, a few steps away from Wall Street. And I think that securing project financing is a major challenge that direct air capture companies are facing today. So I'd like to ask the panel, how should the financial sector be looking at financing direct air capture plants today, and what can policymakers and technology companies and the direct air capture ecosystem do to get financiers engaged in this space?
Well, I'll just kick it off, building on what I just said. You know, you can't turn up at, I've been using this sort of, some of my colleagues know I'm a bad metaphor guy, so here's my bad metaphor. If you want to win Wimbledon and you think you've got the world's best tennis racket technology, you can't show up day one of Wimbledon and win it with the best technology for your tennis racket without having practiced. Practice means winning and losing repeatedly, right? And that's what we need to do here. And we've come a long way over the last couple of years, and we've got corporate offsets and government offsets, purchasing. And we've got some capital for the hubs and such. But the most important thing to get to bankability, which will unleash billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars to scale this technology, is we need to prove out the technologies in the field. We need to practice. And the more we can, and in my view, in the next couple of years, I'm talking about not 2030, I'm not talking about 2050, I'm talking about like the next 24 months, whatever, you can put whatever time frame you want on it, the more we get turns on the technology, the more we'll have the permission from society, from the markets, to grow from there. And what is needed there is capital, in my view, upfront capital to get those turns on the technology, and other things, of course. But you're not going to get the commercial markets yet financing this. So we need to cobble together, which is starting to happen, between government grants, between corporate offsets, even philanthropic vehicles. But most DOE funding requires 50% matching. The offset market is paying on the back end. Typically, we had that conversation. There is some upfront funding. So I feel, and I'd love to hear what you guys think, that we need to start thinking very quickly about how can we get more upfront capital to get experience on the technology sooner.
I totally agree. And when thinking about how to unlock project finance increasingly for direct air capture, I think it helps to root ourselves in what project finance typically does. Project finance is typically capital that is invested in technologies that are largely proven technologically, and they expect to get the money back. They do not plan for losses in the same way that venture capitalists do. And so if you look at those two sides of the equation, we have to prove technology, as Nick just said, and we have to ensure that we can give some amount of guarantee to the people who are investing into these projects that that money will be given back to them at some point. Now, there are interesting mechanisms that are being explored here to loosen those requirements amongst various things. You can talk about things like first loss capital or philanthropic investment, right? There are a lot of vehicles, mechanisms, and ways that people who are trying to be creative about how to unlock these kinds of debt vehicles for new technology that needs to be built faster than it is currently being built. But fundamentally, those needs won't change that much. They will change, and the people who can figure out how to change them will be massive winners in this space, and they will get a lot of really exciting deals done. But project financiers like investing in technology that has been proven and that they can say with some amount of certainty will be paid back over time. And so when we're thinking about how to accelerate the pace of deploying that type of capital into direct air capture, we need to think about it in terms of what the current state is and how we can support bridging the gap between where technology developers like we are and where those project financiers are currently sitting.
Yeah, so in addition to what's been said, perhaps there are other sources of financing for removal that could be untapped. I can think of two examples to start off with what I just shared. When you look at the large emitters, they capture their CO2, often put it to use. The trend is towards sequestration, to storage. So they have, or they're building infrastructures, right? Piping, storage sites, they have industrial sites, they have waste heat in their industrial process that can be used as thermal energy to power DEC, and they have capital. So wouldn't it make sense if, for instance, policymakers or for monetary reasons, large emitters would build DEC hubs alongside their CCS infrastructures, right? For me, that makes a lot of sense. It feels maybe a little bit uncomfortable because then we have to work with the large emitters, but a lot of the solution could be found there, right? And they also have the expertise, by the way, to help with the storage and so on and so forth. So in my discussions, there's appetite from individuals, but the companies don't yet move. So I think we need, public opinion or policymakers to stimulate this, as they have a lot of capacity and all the elements in place, including the financing. The other source of financing I can think of is a trend that we see in Europe, where recently the carbon removal certification framework was passed as a bill on the EU level. And that will invite for countries to start doing co-claiming. And co-claiming means that any negative emission that happens in the country, they can add to their balance for the Paris Accords. And that's driving a lot of legislation and initiatives in European countries. So the moment they can really start to do co-claiming on reliable, measurable negative emissions, they will want to put money there to increase the carbon removal and the negative emissions. So those could be like additional sources to what we're seeing here in the US primarily today.
Jana, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think many great points have already been said about, how do we get private sector financing to support direct air capture facilities. I think to your point around demonstration, I think a lot of companies are sort of in this maybe valley of death is not the right word, but they're sort of in this sort of awkward teenage stage. And because of that, sorry to everyone who's working at a direct air capture company, but because of that, the mid-scale facilities in particular, I think, face acute challenges when it comes to sourcing renewable energy capacity that's additional, to finding storage providers, and because they're at smaller scales, it's really difficult for direct air capture companies to compete with traditional CCS facilities who are storing much more CO2 at larger volumes. And so I think because of that, there's a role for the federal government to come in with these really critical demonstration projects that de-risk the technology and drive down costs to potentially provide incentives for infrastructure partners, supply chain partners, so that we can actually get, for second, third of a kind projects on the ground and get private sector financiers more comfortable with these solutions.
I mean, the good news in my view is that a lot of the sort of fundamental, the necessary conditions, the kindling, if you will, of a fire for this industry are there, right? We now have a growing cohort of technology options on the table, right? Some remarkable flowering over the last several years of technologies. We do have a growing investor ecosystem, folks particularly at the early stages, and then you have folks who are watching at the later stages, and it may not have dipped in yet, but they're definitely now paying attention. You've got developers, right? You've got people who are on the ground developing carbon management projects, and they'd love to put direct air capture in there. You have supply chain discussions, you've got MRV discussions, you've got some policy frameworks in place. A lot of these ingredients are now there, and DAC, direct air capture, is probably one of the more advanced carbon removal pathways on this, on all these, having all these ingredients in place. It's not the only one that we should be deploying or anything like that, but it is relatively down the road. To make this kindling catch fire, we only need to get from 1 to 5 projects out there in some major pathways, and then all of a sudden this stuff will be bankable and it will just be game over and we'll be able to scale. So the gap that we need to cross now, we've come so far, we're really close, but this is one of those valley of death moments. And so, the idea of having corporate or philanthropic or government supplements, if you will, or combinations or collaborations to get us over that hump, I think is really important and where we need to be thinking in the near term.
So you just said near term. I think that we often think about or discuss direct air capture and carbon removal with fairly long time horizons. We talk about we need a gigaton of DAC. The IEA says we need a gigaton by 2050. And they also say that to be on track for that, we need to have 80 megatons, or roughly 80 megatons by 2030. It is halfway through 2020, roughly halfway through 2024. What do you see? Do you see us, for one, being on track to hit that goal, and what needs to happen to get us on track if we're not in the next 1 to 2 years, like in the real tangible near term?
Well, 80 megatons being removed in 2030 means that there are 80 individual megaton projects that will be operating in 2030, which means that next year we need 80 megaton projects at least under development, because it will take somewhere between 3 to 5 years for those projects to actually be installed, and then some amount of time after that for those projects to be commissioned. That means that next year we need around 80 storage capacity locations that can store at least a megaton per year, maybe class 6 wells. Maybe we make a lot of concrete in a given place, I don't know. But there are a lot of things that need to fall into place for those projects to actually happen. And more importantly, in 2030, we need 80 million tons of revenue flowing into direct air capture. That's equal to at least $8 billion in 2030 of revenue flowing into DAC if you take a $100 per ton price point, which I think I'm just saying because it's an easy math number for me to do sitting on a panel like this. But there are a lot of things that need to fall into place for us to actually hit that target. And I can say that, when I've spoken to lots of other DAC technology developers, everybody is working on some amount of megaton projects, and maybe 1 and maybe 2 by that time frame, but we need 80 to hit that target. 80 is a lot. And so I think that we need to ensure that companies that are developing the technologies and the projects that will be delivering those tons feel secure to make the investments required to actually get up to that number. And I think that really falls back to ensuring that we have the continued growth in the demand side of this market to support that amount of capital being invested.
So as a technology provider, DAC technology provider, we are involved in carbon removal projects, like with our friends of Deep Sky, which has been published, but other projects as well, also here in North America. But I'm fascinated by this so I don't want to be like a broken record, but I'm fascinated by the siloed view of CCS and DAC. And I think a lot of the solution can be found there. As I'm not going to call out any names, but we have discussions with emitters that have an infrastructure. The infrastructure is there. We can start building tomorrow. The fascinating thing is, if you talk to people about point source capture, so here's a large emitter. No, we're not blowing our CO2 in the air, we're capturing it and we're putting it to use to stimulate food production. Oh, that's great, well done. But if you think of it, the process of capturing the CO2 from the exhaust, then taking the toxic gases out, then liquefying it, then transporting it to where it's needed, is actually adding emissions. And then through food or your champagne or whatever, the CO2 comes in the atmosphere. So it's a postponed and amplified emission. So with a little bit of irony, these emitters would better just blow their CO2 in the air from a climate lens, right? So I think, you know, near term, we should all be aware, not only in this bubble here, but society as a whole, policymakers should be made aware that large emitters have to store their CO2 and not put it to use. That way, as I said before, there's a huge volume needed of DEC systems to be installed there where the CO2 is needed, which will give a boost to our industry and to the supply chain maturity and all of that. But it also opens up the opportunity for the large emitters to add DEC facilities to their CCS infrastructures. And what they then can do is solve their historic emissions. So I'm only in this industry for 2 years now, being appointed as CEO. And I'm just fascinated by the isolation of the different lenses and the lack of climate awareness when we talk about emissions. In my perspective, it's a CO2 universe that needs to be seen as a system and needs to be changed in a systematic way.
Yeah, I mean, I've said it already, turns, practice, practice, practice. That's what we need to do in the next 2 years. And I think one of the things that we've been thinking about the Direct Air Capture Coalition with, you know, which is multi-stakeholder, trying to bring in not just the technology companies, but the NGOs, the supply chain, the research institutes, the corporates, the capital, is saying, you know, where do we need to be in 2030? We talked about 80, right, projects. Where are we today, and what are sort of the 5 to 8 major threads? I've been beating the capital drum, but there are other ones that we need to really be working to be able to, you know, get even close to the goal there. And so having clarity on what those things are, and you know, access to energy, sufficient capital, sequestration permits, you know, you can start thinking, it's not that hard to think about what some of the critical path things are. And having a clear-eyed view of what those are, and developing indicators of how we're doing on that, I think is really important. I mean, the challenging thing is that this is no longer just a concept, right? CDR is no longer a concept. Direct air capture is no longer a concept. We're in that difficult phase of having to do something. But we're privileged to be in this position, right? We're super lucky that there's this many people that want to come from around the world to this conference here, and many others around the world, and have this conversation representing organizations with power, knowledge, and money. So yeah, it's hard. We got a lot of work to do, but in the next 2 years, I think just having a clear-eyed view of kind of where we're at and where we really need to be is going, you know, we need to put steel on our back and like do the hard work. That's unfortunately what the next couple years mean. And if we can do that, society and the markets, as I said, will give us the permission to go to the next level.
I think the thing that I would add to this is the actual building of the projects is something is pretty difficult. And I think in particular in the US, the permitting and regulatory scheme makes it extremely difficult to build any project, much less a direct air capture project. And so I think really in the next few years, we need to be laying the regulatory and permitting groundwork to make sure that all of the companies who are trying to build these megaton facilities can actually put steel in the ground. And that means making sure that we can, you know, expeditiously but thoroughly review Class 6 well applications, which is the program under the EPA that makes sure that we can safely store CO2 underground. It means updating them to include new technologies like mineralization as a form of storage. And it also, I think, means working with local communities to build capacity and knowledge around direct air capture so that when companies come in and try to build projects, we're not starting from square one, and that these communities can really engage in an effective way and, you know, bring their own knowledge and expertise about what's best for their regions. And I think one of the challenges that we're facing now is that direct air capture is such a new concept that, you know, we're putting a very significant burden on the companies who are developing these technologies to not just, you know, talk about their specific project, but to also talk about what direct air capture is, what carbon removal is, how does it fit into the climate math, and that I think requires a lot of time and effort and, relationship and trust building with these communities. And so we need to start doing that work now if we want to be able to build projects in 5 years.
Anything to add, or? So, I'd like to ask, you all have been working in DAC for some time, and I'd like to ask about lessons learned.
Put your mic up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'd like to ask about lessons learned. What have you learned since you've been working in this space, and what do you wish more people knew about DAC? And I'd like you to think about this from 2 different perspectives. One, what do you wish the people in this room, meaning the CDR ecosystem, knew about DAC? And the people outside this room, so the general public that you think would be valuable for them to understand.
Should I start?
Go for it.
So what I've learned in these 2 years is there's a lot of opinion and emotion rather than a rational approach, which is kind of interesting, but I think it's also counterproductive for the development of this industry. So for the people here in our bubble, I would like to point out that you, Jason and Nicholas, you've done tremendous important work to build an association, the DEC Coalition, that we're all member of, or the technology companies, so I would like to thank you for that. But I also would like to point out here that anybody from an enterprise here that has a budget to combat climate change, why don't you donate some money to the DEC Coalition?
So I just would like everyone for this to be the key takeaway that they get and the #1 action item. daccoalition.org/donate. Make sure to include that link in your LinkedIn write-ups. Thank you.
Neither of us paid him. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, they're on a shoestring budget, and they deserve to have more resources. So, and then, for people outside of this room, the public in general, I wish that there was more acknowledgement that DEC is a great solution, that it's not 10 years away, that it might be a little bit expensive now, a little bit energy intensive, but if we keep using that as an argument to not act, that will not change.
Make sure you donate, first of all.
Love the echoing there.
The thing that's been really exciting to find out over the past 4 years working in something that has come to be called carbon removal is that you can really strike up partnerships in extremely unexpected places within this industry. And I'm not just talking about partnerships like offtake partnerships. I'm talking about partnerships like project development opportunities or looking at ways to build community support. And they really exist all over the place. We have examples of we've seen agricultural partners jumping in to support this new technology. We've seen large industrials. We've seen many different kinds of companies, some of which make a lot of sense, but some of which are a wonderful joy to come across. And so I think that's been really exciting to find, and to the people in this room, I would say that never underestimate the willingness of somebody to jump in to support our climate in a way that may not be obvious. To people outside of this room, I think it comes down to the fact that carbon removal is, yes, it's a societal good, and it's something that we are going to be offering to avoid a negative externality, but there are also lots of benefits that can be offered to first movers in ways that are becoming obvious right now. I fly United. I don't know if anybody else in this room does, but every time I walk down a jet bridge to board a United flight, you see a massive rendering of a direct air capture facility right there on the jet bridge. These kinds of benefits that can be offered to first movers within this space can provide lots of payback over time in ways that are not actually easy to measure, but are very knowledgeable, right? I know exactly what the advertisement looks like. I can see it in my eyes, in my mind's eye, every time I'm walking down a bridge. And so it's these kinds of things that require first movers to really jump in and second movers and third movers to continue to support this industry in the way that we need to get to that 80 million tons that we have 6 years to get to.
DAC made Saturday Night Live. Did anybody see that? Oh, yeah. It was on, yeah,
We've
on
made
NewsHour,
it.
News. Colin Jost, yeah. Climeworks had announced their Mammoth plant recently, and that was, I mean, it was the butt of a joke, but it was still, it was there. It was there. No, that's really important. That's really important. Gianna?
Yeah, I'm happy to go. I think for folks in this room, I think it's really easy to be pessimistic in the carbon removal space. I think it's really easy to be pessimistic about direct air capture. I think seeing the Mammoth facility in person, gave me a little, spark of optimism. And so I think for people in this room, I think it's like really important to hold on to that. And I think a key part of innovation, a key part of the demonstration and the hard work of building the projects inevitably means failures, but that's by design. And so I think it's really important that all of us know that there are going to be stumbles, there are going to be setbacks in this field, but we do have to keep charging forward. And that's something that we've seen for a number of different technologies, and that's part of the innovation process. And so we need to sort of like continue despite some of those challenges. I think for the broader field, I would, for the folks outside of this room, I would want to emphasize the key role that policy can really play in developing technologies. Everything from like the Google Maps on our phone to Siri were things that were incubated within the Department of Energy, within the Department of Defense, rely on NASA satellites, and really a lot of government RD&D, particularly in the US, underpins a lot of the technologies that we use, and we can use that same toolkit here with carbon removal. And so I think there's a role for the general public as constituents to really push their members of Congress to care about this. I think the folks in the US Congress right now who care about this are like 20 climate wonks who are very similar to all of us, and we really need to expand the number of champions, and the only way that we can do that is by making constituents care about this, whether those constituents are climate wonks like us, or whether they're folks who have jobs at a direct air capture facility, or have extra renewable energy capacity because they're located next to a DAC facility. So I think the more we make these solutions real, the more we can empower people to build political will for these things.
Totally agree. Well, here's the bad news for the people in this room. In 17 years of working on DAC, I've had less than this many organizations come up to us at Global Thermostat and say, how can we help? It just doesn't happen. The market and the world out there is self-centered, short-sighted, and brutal. It just is, right? So just get over it. I mean, you mentioned it. It's like we've had to carry the water for this entire industry, a small number of underfunded companies. Now there's over 100 companies, but originally there's like 2 or 3 of us, and we were carrying all the water. Now we spread it across 100. And now it is spreading, but I mean, it is just brutal to do all that on your own. That's just the way the world is. I'll get to the good news. I would want people in this room and outside the room to don't get distracted by discussions on cost. Like, unit economics are fundamentally important, but it's just like I've seen the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Axios or the Bloomberg or whatever article on like, what is the current cost of direct air capture and what can it get to and how does it compare to, like, just, it's such a distraction. The journalists have, I love journalists, and particularly in this world we need to defend journalists, but like, they have been writing the same article for 17 freaking years. And it doesn't help. It just distracts people, and it's an excuse, in my opinion, for inaction. So I would just push back on people. Yes, we absolutely need to make this economic, but we know from all of human history that technologies follow an S-curve, right? It gets higher than you expect initially, right? You go up when you confront reality, goes up, and then it goes way down below where even your best predictions think it might go over the long term. You just need to get experience. It's called the experience curve, the learning curve. And so, of course, if you're running a direct air capture company or investing, these numbers matter. But in terms of the zeitgeist, the discussion of should we act or shouldn't we act, please push back on this stupid conversation around cost, okay? The other thing I would want people to know is that, as was said already, I mean, we're all here because we believe we must do this, but I also think it's really important. It's not just a must. It's not like we're forced to do this. It's better if we do this. Air-based carbon as a substitute for fossil-based carbon is much better for the world. Air is everywhere. Like, instead of having these geopolitical distortions of having these concentrated sources of fossil energy, and the carbon resources around the planet. We now have the ability over time, it's going to take a long time, but to unlock sources of carbon for everyone, everywhere, for development, for economic development, for human development. And it's cleaner, it solves the climate problem, and it's more equitable. A lot of work to make sure that reality comes true, sustainably, equitably, and all that, but that possibility is inherently there in the nature of the resource. So I would want people to know outside of this room, it's not just something, gee, we have to do to avoid catastrophe, it's actually better. And then the final thing I would just say is, going back to the first point, we are going to achieve this, in my view, we're going to need to radically collaborate, right? Competition is really important. I'm a capitalist. I believe in competition. It's been really healthy to have competition and growing competition in this marketplace. But we also need to break down organizational barriers as quickly as possible and find ways to collaborate to get this moving faster, right? And so unless we do that, unless we get on a war footing of the way the Ukrainians have been behaving, and they're still, who knows what's going to happen there. That's the situation we're actually in, and we need to figure out new ways of collaborating across organizational boundaries and moving faster. But as I said before, the ingredients are there. The kindling is there. This fire can burn really brightly if we do that.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes for maybe one or two questions from the audience. Sir?
My name is Anish Simon. I have a reflection and a question. I work for one of the large emitters, but as the head of
I
carbon,
couldn't read the name tag from here.
as head of carbon removal with ambition to develop DAC and DOC projects, right? In my vernacular, DAC was not there 3 years ago. I'm a newbie to this space. So I fully agree with your comment that we need to work together. The Class 6 wells are subsurface issues. The CCS people will figure out. We're driving down the cost there. The DAC, driving down technology costs, that is what we need to focus on. But the question I have is about the power side of the story. We talked about the 80 million ton. We're also competing, or we're driving this decarbonization towards electrification of the grid that's going on. How do you see the fight for power for carbon removal meeting society's need for decarbonization of grid, and would that become a hindrance for us?
So I can start. I think I invited you through the app to talk, right? Okay, we should definitely talk. And thank you for the acknowledgement. That's really really nice of you. So when we look at power at industrial sites, I think a lot of the solution for the technology that we're in, which is a temperature swing, can come from thermal energy, from waste energy, from the industrial process itself. So with our friends of Pure Earth, we were in discussion for months to make sure that waste heat is acknowledged as a carbon-free source of energy, because the carbon is already accounted for in the industrial process, and they agreed. So if I'm well informed, it is or will be in their methodology. So then, 60%-ish of the power we need comes from an industrial source where there's often no use of that waste heat. Often it's even a problem. So that's a great way of collaborating on industrial sites, and then the remaining power, of course, should come from renewable energy, preferably not competing with, the people that live in the area and need that renewable energy.
That's a great question, Anish. I think there are two ways that we think about this. Way one is we have magic wands that can wish things into existence, and way two is we don't. And in way one, it would be really great to see, to Nick's earlier point, a lot of collaboration coming together in some way, shape, or form to offer to renewable energy project developers the things that they care about, which are really just larger and larger projects, right? I think we forget that because we're working in something that I sometimes feel is incredibly noble, and maybe others do as well, people should just want to work with us, when in reality, the things that are important to people are always going to drive them to do whatever it is that they're doing. And so when we're thinking about deploying renewable energy, well, the things that are important to those developers are getting larger and larger projects that they can commit larger and larger amounts of power to. Collaboration can solve that. Government policy can solve that. Partnering with existing industrial companies can solve that. There are many ways to think about how you can actually work around that challenge, but it is a challenge that needs to be solved, and it's not one that I think will be just as easy as NextEra or other renewable project developer trust me DAC startup to be able to consume 300 megawatts of power 5 years after we were founded. Like that is a really hard thing for people to buy into, and so instead, thinking about how we can spread that risk to them across many people is a way to attack that problem. I think the other thing I think about, if we don't have this magic wand here, then the next question I go to is how can we be flexible within the frameworks that exist to us now? How can we flexibly plug into power wherever it may be available to us? Maybe it's not baseload, and maybe there are some technological changes that need to happen to direct air capture to allow for that to be enabled. But thinking about ways to leverage other people's projects and other people's infrastructure to allow for us to deploy projects and consume that power consume that power flexibly is, I think, the second option that is available to us, but ultimately it goes back to incentives, right? And thinking about how can we align the incentives of the people that are building renewable projects with the incentives or with the needs that this industry has.
Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I mean, we need, as I said before, we need to get turns on the technology in the next 2 or 3 years as much as possible, and piling with criteria and requirements on top of that are perfect is not going to help us get there. Ultimately, we need to massively increase the amount of renewable energy. We're only, our friends at Climeworks have said, we're only using currently about 1% of the renewable energy on the planet. We need to increase that significantly. The energy is there, right? AI is going to require us to go from 2% of energy consumption for data centers today to 8% in like the next 10 years. So this is a bigger problem than just DAC or carbon removal. I don't have the answers, but we have to, it's just a reality. So we have to face it, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of good as we do so.
Well, thank you all. I apologize that we don't have time for any other questions, but if everyone can give a round of applause to our excellent panelists.